trick," he said one morning, working the knife around a particularly stubborn joint, "is not to fight what you're cutting. Let the blade do the thinking."
Mother, the Mirror, and the Silence. Northern England, winter, 1860. The winter of the year I learnt to count had edges. It carved the fields into fields, and the roads into roads, and each breath stood as small, white proof before one's face ere it vanished, as though it had imagined existence differently. In our house, winter was a room fellow. It sat in the cracks of windows, lay beneath the hearth, crept into the children's beds whenever it could manage. One knew it was there because fingernails turned blue and teeth chattered the rhythm in the night. I should have liked to tell you I was born into warmth. It is more pleasant to begin stories as one begins a fire, with straw that catches easily. But our kitchen smelled of tallow and wet wood, and what warmth there was depended upon the coal's willingness. When the coal would not, then it would not. Mother set her cup silently upon the table, as though it were made only of sound, not clay. There were days when her face did not reach the light from the windows. Then she looked as though she belonged to the furniture. On other days her gaze was so sharp that the spoon rattled when she merely raised her hand. In the corner hung a mirror, small and blind. It had chips around the edge that looked like coldness in glass. Mother called it the good mirror, though it gave scarce reflection. I understood later that people call things good when what they had before was worse. The mirror knew our faces like names one had taught it, shadowy, modest, as though any sharpness were waste. When I stood before it, my face was a collection of suggestions. From suggestions people are made, if one lets them stand. Mother spoke little. I copied her way, as children echo without knowing the words. Silence is a language one understands early, when the oven is the only voice that dares speak. One can learn much from how pots simmer and how water pleads with the lid. Mother worked with hands that knew more than her mouth. She washed, she sewed, she scraped bread crusts from bowls. And she did this without need of fuss. Sometimes she paused and laid her fingers upon the table, as though listening to a sound only she could hear. Like when seabird shadows cross a wall, and yet there is no sea in the room. I remember an evening when the wind tested our front door, whether it was truly a door or merely a suggestion of wood. Father was away. He was often away. When he was present, he smelled of counter-pressure, of ale, of stable, of tools. His voice had the grain of wood against which it broke. Mother moved the tallow candle nearer to the mirror. "One sees better when one believes in seeing," she said, and I understood. One sees better when one decides what one sees.
Oh, where are my manners? My name is Grimwick. And that was just one page of tonight's diary.
I learned in that time to count things. Cracks in floorboards, breaths that sleep did not take, footsteps in the house that were ours, and those we invented. Counting orders. It makes the world into rows that one places together until they form a carpet. I counted Mother's gestures too. 1, when she lifted the bucket. 2, when she tipped the water. 3, when she tied her apron. At the 4th gesture, her hands sometimes remained in the air, as though she wished to grasp something not in the room. Then she began again at 1. I grasped that repetition is a key, not to unlock, but to lull to sleep what wishes to wake. The vicar spoke on Sundays of how God loved order. Order was when each thing was in its place and each soul in its duty. I looked about our pew and saw order, yes. Shoes that stood side by side, caps laid upon knees like small animals one had calmed. But I saw too that order takes away breath when it knows not what to do with it. The Psalms drew the gaze to the ceiling, yet I listened to the sides. The creaking of pews, the coughing of the poor who tried not to sound poor. I thought, order is good when it is quiet. Loud, it is merely another name for fear. The mirror on our wall taught me a second thought, that a picture is not truth, but a contract. It shows what it can show and conceals what does not fit within it. Mother once held a needle before it and said one could not see the point, only the gleam, and that it was the same with people. I loved this thought, that things do not feel obliged to undress merely because one looks at them. The market and the first lesson. At the edge of the livestock market stood the table with the channel. The man lifted the rabbit by its hind legs, as though it were merely a poorly sewn pouch. A cut, scarcely a breath's length, and the skin loosened like a wet sleeve. The tissue yielded with a dull thud, there where the small cartilage attempted its brief protest. The smell came immediately, warm, ferrous, as though one had laid a rusty nail upon the tongue. The blade remained unmoved. The man did not clean it. He let it be cold, precise, and the stain found its own way down the table. I noted the direction of the hand and the angle at which the cut continued its work of its own accord, when one simply allowed it. That was the first honest lesson. Sharpness is a decision. Everything else is excuse, dull knives, and people who claim the world is to blame when something does not come clean. Beside it hung a lamb, suspended on hooks like a question no one answered. Another man drew his finger along the blade, testing not the edge, but his own readiness. He nodded. It was a nod made of metal. I watched as long as was necessary, and no longer. The women said I should look away. The men said I should learn. I did both. I looked and took away what disturbed. The image remained, ordered by sound, the short whistle of the blade, the heavier thrust when it finds something unwilling, and the quiet, almost polite, yielding when one strikes the line that nature had already drawn. I thought, the world is full of lines one cannot see until one asks where they are. The snow fell in that winter not heavily, but hard. It lay at the edges of the roads like salt no one wished to spare. I often went to the brickworks behind the field, not because I must, but because the smoke there was different, red and heavy, as though one could knead it into cloth. The men there had faces that looked like walls with pieces missing. They spoke little, they nodded much. I liked how they took bricks from molds, a birth that needed no women. Everything about it was repeatable, reliable, a comfort in a world where much did not hold. I thought that a person might become like a brick, useful if he burns well. One afternoon, I stood by the ditch behind the brickworks and found a mirror in the mud. It was smaller than ours, but smoother, with a sharp edge that demanded to test the skin. I lifted it, washed it in water that carried the sky, and held it against the sun. Its light struck my face, and for a moment I saw nothing but the white of inflammation. I laughed. A boy laughs at things that might become dangerous if one took them seriously. When I could see again, I saw my face, more orderly than at home. The edges stood firm. The eyes were 2 points that no one smudged. I thought, perhaps truth is merely a question of light, and whoever can hold the light decides what is true. Mother took the mirror from me when I showed it to her. "Don't cut yourself," she said, and the sentence meant more. She placed it high upon the cupboard, where things lay that we owned but were not permitted to use. The letter from the vicar that helped no one any longer. The box with buttons, waiting for coats that never came. In the night, I dreamed that I climbed upon the cupboard, light as mist, and took the mirror without touching it. I woke with hands that held something, and with a feeling as though someone had watched me who had always been in the room. The mathematics of observation. There was in the village a dog that saw everything. He sat by day at the threshold of the smithy and looked upon the street, as though testing each step for its claim to reality. When children came too near, he merely lifted his head briefly, as though calculating. Danger in measure, harmless. I loved this dog for his mathematics. One day he followed me a distance, to the corner where the hedge begins. So thick one believes it carries a secret. He stopped, as though he knew that secrets are catching. The nights grew long. In our parlour stood the clock the vicar had lent us, because father had mended his gate. The clock ran fast, sometimes too much, sometimes just enough to make morning earlier. I lay awake and listened to it. In the stroke that makes the hour lies a blade, quite narrow, that travels through the day cutting slices from everything. One can estimate in the dark the size of the slices. I estimated them well. I learnt to wait, not like one who waits for something to come, but like one who knows something is already there, only not yet visible. In school, I stood beside a window that let the cold world into the warm room. The teacher had a voice that could push light. She said numbers were just because they meant the same for everyone. I raised my hand and asked whether one was the same for all, when one took something that no one missed. She looked at me as though I were a word that disturbed the sentence, and said justice was no business. I grasped. There are answers one believes from politeness. The men spoke in the tavern of things larger than our village. War, trade. Cities where houses stood so close one could not lose oneself, except within oneself. A merchant from the south told of London, a city that heard more breathing than we could ever count. I laid my head against the cold wall of the shed and heard through the stone how they laughed. I heard too how they grew quiet when the word work came, which in some mouths sounded like a threat. The geometry of violence. Winter 1860 brought death to our street. Mrs. Hartwell from 3 doors down took fever on a Tuesday and was gone by Friday's bell. The women wore black that was more memory than cloth, and they spoke in half sentences that the wind completed. Mother took Supercross, whose recipe was the same as all recipes in our street. Water with what remains. I was not permitted inside, so I stood at the threshold and saw the shoes of the men who stood within, close together, as though they feared falling apart. The door let out the smell. Soap that had failed. Air too heavy for the room. I thought of the words going and gone, and how they are not the same. Going is movement. Gone is a property. Like the difference between the blade entering and the moment when resistance ceases. One is action, the other is state. The men spoke in voices, careful not to wake something already sleeping forever. That night, Mother spoke a sentence that never returned. One cannot prevent something from happening. One can only learn to hear it before it speaks. I lay down with this sentence, and it lay beside me like a third body, large, warm, and uncomfortable. I tried to listen. The house gave answer. The stair that sighs in its middle. The hearth that breathes heavily in sleep. The ropes in the yard where wind plays when no one has hung washing there. The world, I thought, is full of announcements. One must only be old enough not to mistake them for chance. Father was a man who preferred to repair things that did not belong to him. He fitted handles to doors our neighbors had long abandoned, and when they asked why, he said, because something must be firm. When he tidied the workbench, he took the knife from Sheffield in his hand as though it were an animal one must calm. He said steel was honest if one treated it rightly. It showed where it broke and why. Wood, however, lied, with knotholes that pretended to be eyes. I liked steel for this honesty. I liked the knife because it did not promise to be kind. Sometimes, when Father was away and evening came too quickly, Mother took a comb and drew it through my hair with a care that no one noticed, except me. I asked her once whether she had been happy before I came. She did not smile, but her eyes grew soft, as bread becomes when it waits too long in the pot. Happiness, she said, is the sound things make when they stop hurting. I have since then listened for sounds. The language of precision. The market taught me that every cut has its own voice. The butcher's apprentice, a boy scarce older than myself, showed me how to hold the blade, not gripped like fear, but rested like confidence. Feel for the give, he said, pressing my fingers to where the joint surrenders. Everything has a place it wants to come apart. Your job is to find it, not to force it. I watched him work through a side of mutton, each incision deliberate as prayer. The knife whispered through muscle, sang against bone, sighed through fat. He explained the anatomy not in terms of what lived, but what could be separated. See here, he said, tracing a line with his fingertip. Nature draws the maps. We just follow them. There was poetry in his precision. No wasted motion, no uncertain cuts. Each stroke had purpose, beginning and end predetermined by the architecture of flesh. I understood then that violence need not be chaos. In the right hands, with the right knowledge, It could be something approaching art. The boy, Tom his name was, had steady hands and quiet eyes. He worked in the early hours when the market was empty, save for shadows and the occasional cat hunting scraps. I would arrive before dawn, slipping through the grey streets while the city still dreamed, to watch him transform carcass into commodity. He never asked why I came, perhaps sensing that some education cannot be requested, only witnessed. "The trick," he said one morning, working the knife around a particularly stubborn joint, "is not to fight what you're cutting. Let the blade do the thinking. Force makes mess, and mess makes waste." The cartilage parted with a sound like tearing silk, and he smiled, not at the cut, but at its cleanliness. I began to understand that there were rules to such work, mathematics invisible to the casual observer. Angle of entry, depth of cut, the precise moment when resistance would cease. Tom taught me to read the signs. The color change that signaled a different tissue, the subtle shift in texture that marked a natural boundary. In the long evenings, when work was done and father dozed by the dying fire, I would take the small mirror from its hiding place and study my reflection by candlelight. The face that looked back seemed each night a little different, as though the glass were slowly teaching me who I might become. Mother found me one such evening, mirror in hand, candle flame dancing across my features. She stood in the doorway watching, her expression unreadable in the shifting light. Finally she spoke. "What do you see?" "A face," I answered. "Whose face?" The question hung between us like smoke. I considered it carefully, examining the features in the glass. The dark eyes that seemed always to be calculating, the mouth that had learned early to keep its own counsel, the pale skin that rarely saw full sun. "Mine," I said at last, though the word felt uncertain. She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the worn floorboards. "And what is yours?" Another riddle. Mother spoke often in such puzzles, as though straightforward answers were somehow dangerous. I looked again at the reflection, trying to see beyond the surface to whatever truth she was testing me to find. "What I make it," I said. She nodded then, satisfied with something in my response. "Remember that," she said. "The mirror shows only what is. You decide what will be." That night I dreamed of faces changing like water, flowing from one form to another, until I could no longer tell which was real and which was reflection. I woke with the strange certainty that both were true and neither. Conclusion. When I think now of that winter, the winter when counting became important and mirrors told their first lies, I see not snow or cold or the grey monotony of poverty. I see instead a boy learning to read the hidden writing of the world, the grammar of giving and taking, the syntax of sharp and dull, the vocabulary of what is necessary and what is merely kind. Every lesson of those months was preparation, though for what I could not then have said. The patient observation of Mother's silent efficiency, the mathematical precision of Tom's cuts, the steady accumulation of knowledge about pressure and resistance, and the moment when strength becomes weakness. The mirror taught me that truth is a matter of light and angle. The knife taught me that everything has its breaking point if one knows where to look. The winter taught me that the world makes its own sense, for those with patience to learn its language. And Mother, dear Mother, taught me the most important lesson of all, that what we become is not what we are born to be, but what we choose to make of the tools we are given. The tools and the knowledge of how to use them. That is enough for today. A diary need not complete its thoughts. It suffices to write them at the margin, there where fingers brush when turning pages. There they remain, until one notices the margins have grown thicker than the text itself.
Ah. I trust you enjoyed this glimpse into a most curious diary. If so, leave behind a small token of your delight with a like, and do consider joining our circle by subscribing. And remember, ring the little bell, and you shall be the very first to know when another diary or a fresh entry emerges from the shadows. And if a whisper stirs in your mind, a thought, a riddle, perhaps a name of someone whose secrets you would dare to uncover, leave it for me below. I read them one by one. And who knows, your wish may guide my hand to the very next diary I choose from my collection.